Hey, welcome back, everybody. Welcome back. We are live once again on Sunday. Thank you for being with us. Here with Kristen and here with Victor again. Welcome
What's
back
going on? Good morning.
to Victor and welcome Kristen to the show.
Hello.
So if you wouldn't mind, just give us a quick 2-minute rundown of your elevator pitch of your job and what you do and why you're here with us today.
Yeah, my name is Kristen Ross. Full disclosure, I'm not military affiliated. I know it's kind of please don't hold it against me. I know. But I have been working with military service members, veterans, military spouses for the last 10 years now. Working with them as they kind of separate, go through, developing a resume the first time, everything like that. The last 7 years, I have been specializing in federal employment. So how do you navigate that federal system? Ins, the outs, what does it mean to have eligibility in different ways? How to use veterans preference? And so, for the last 2 years, I've been our federal program manager and just continuing forward with making sure everybody gets the information they need because it's a very confusing process. Some days I still, hold on, I have to get these wires straightened out. But yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell. I'm a very nerdy person, so I get down in the weeds of what is federal policy, what does this look like, how do we navigate it. There's the adage where it's creativity within restriction, and I find that federal employment's a really fun place to kind of play with that, and how do you navigate it and present yourself in that interview process. So yeah, that's me.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I'm sure we're going to be digging into a ton of things and hopefully getting down to the nuts and bolts of the federal hiring process, the resume writing for federal, and things of that nature. I do want to ask you a strange kind of off the wall question. In your experience, is there a like a chart or a graph that you keep in your office or you keep track of? Because you said you get very nerdy and very technical with the numbers and all that stuff. Do you track the success rates of the people that you work with when you're putting together the resumes and getting them through the hiring and all that?
We try to, just based on kind of how we navigate that internally. It's kind of hard to say, we have X number of success rate. We can look at it more organizationally and we can see, how many people we've helped and how many people have ultimately gotten federal employment. But we can also kind of just look at kind of broader numbers of who's kind of seen more success based on kind of going through the process that we go through, because I do feel like it's helpful for somebody, even if they ultimately decide not to go into federal employment, to kind of do some of the breakdown of your experience that we ask them to for federal. So we have some numbers, but maybe not as good as I would like.
Yeah. Okay. No worries. I definitely want to jump right into this, and we can either go off of the charts that you gave me or just go off of some question and answers, or both, a combination of both. But what I do want to talk about is the differences between federal resume and a regular resume. Just a quick.
I will try to give quick answers.
No, actually, go ahead and give the longest answer you want. It's totally fine. We're here for the long run, and people know if they're here watching, they know that we're here for long form. We don't like to keep it too short. So go ahead.
So kind of, I see the biggest difference in a private sector resume and a federal sector resume is how you're using it to demonstrate your experience. When it comes to a private sector resume, and I apologize, I talk with my hands. Let me know if I need to keep them on.
I do too.
But like your private sector resume tends to be full of very quick, impactful statements. You're told not to keep it longer than 2 pages, as much as you can keep it to 1 page in some industries. That's what you need to do. Federal, when you're looking at the qualifications, they're typically asking for you to demonstrate the experience that you have, typically 1 year of experience. But as it demonstrates how you meet all of those qualifications, they always have language that says, we will not make assumptions on your behalf. They're looking for narrative content, and a lot of times you'll see that terminology on job announcements as well. So they're actually looking for you to almost provide like an interview type answer within your resume to just connect all of those dots. So not just what was the impact that you had, but what was the situation that you had to navigate? What was your role in this situation? You know, not just a very quick summary of the actions, but you can give 2, 3 sentences of actions that you took to achieve those outcomes, because it's less about demonstrating, you know, your impact and how you can grow, and more about demonstrating the experience that you're bringing to the table. So it's kind of just a shift in how you need to think about presenting yourself in your resume. Um, but because, you know, a lot of the times you'll look at qualifications that say we need to demonstrate 1 year of specialized experience equivalent to the next lower GS level. So they're already kind of calculating in there that, you know, you're looking at it from, you need to not be at that level, but at least that level of having that baseline knowledge. But you have a lot of flexibility in the, you know, 1 year of experience. How are you going to highlight your experiences? How are you going to really focus in on what's relevant? Because you don't have to include everything. That's a big misunderstanding, is that you have to include everything you've ever done. Include what is most relevant, most meaningful, most impactful to that job announcement. This is my quick elevator pitch on the differences there, but there are so many little details of how you can pull, certain things out and highlight it and navigate all of that, and I'm sure we'll get into it, so
So Kristen, it's not good to submit your master resume, is what you're saying.
Okay.
As I've done that before, and it's not worked out for me.
Full disclosure, I personally hate the term master resume. I know
Okay.
everybody loves it, everybody loves that term, and there's value in putting together everything that you've done, but if you're
Mhm.
not focusing it for at least the job series, if not, you know, really honing in on specific positions and GS levels, there's just so much content, and they're gonna get lost in the weeds before they even figure out how you're
Yeah.
most qualified for that job.
Right.
Um,
Right. So is your advice to tailor each resume to each job that you're trying to apply to? So like if I've done like a plethora of different things and I'm applying to say like a human resources position and I have just a little bit of human resources, should I expand on that or should I include other things that I've done aside from human resources, do you think?
um, One, you should definitely build out the human resources. If
Yeah.
you've had additional experience within the last 10 years, it's not a bad thing to include it. You still kind of want to follow some of those private sector best practices. So
Mhm.
back 10 years is still pretty good, but you don't have to include everything you did in other positions if it's not relevant. Sometimes it can have like good transferable skills. Um, but really building out and focusing in on that HR experience would be
Mhm.
where they're going to be looking. They kind of do go through that specialized experience requirement. Where do I have this? You know, where am I finding this? You're indicating all of these things on your occupational questionnaire. Where is that answer directly in your resume? Perfect. I found it. We're done. We're moving on. Um, so having like smaller masters or like a series master would be helpful. That way, if you're kind of targeting maybe 2 or 3 different series, that way you don't have to start over each time.
Yeah.
But having that one big master of everything, will probably become more cumbersome than it will be helpful.
Yeah. You know, I didn't think about that. A series master. So like there's what I don't know the series off the top of my head, but you know, there's human resources, there's different admin. So just have a master set for that specific
Mhm.
series. No, that I like that. I've not heard that before. Thank you for that input for anybody else out there listening too.
Yeah, especially if you're looking at HR, you'd have one specific more for like your
Yeah.
HR 200 series. A lot of the time,
Mhm.
people who are in HR are looking at either admin or maybe management program analyst positions. So having one
Mhm.
specific for the 343 series, different things like that, where it's already focused in on, you know, maybe we're looking at more data analysis, program analysis versus how are we, you know, applying HR policies and procedures? How are we communicating difficult information, things like that, where, you know, there might be some overlap, there might be some significant differences.
And for the people who may like, for the listeners, most of our audience is either getting ready to retire or already retired or have done at least 10 or 20 years in the military. When I look at my resume, right, there's a ton of experience in different jobs and different things that I've done over the years. And I know a lot of people ask this question, a ton of people ask this question in many, many, many forums about gaps in the resume. If there's a gap year of unemployment or 2 years or whatever, would it be safe to say if you're doing an HR resume and HR is only maybe 2 job experiences within your entire resume, shuffle, would it be safe to say that you would want to then take some of the other job experiences that you have that are not related to that job and kind of just shorten them down or shrink them down to like one sentence? I mean, how do you go about doing that?
Well, depending on the timelines that are involved in some of that, that's where you can really get into some of that, creative within restrictions. They're telling you specifically, we're looking for this in your resume. You have it. Um, you can bump the things that are most relevant up to the top of your resume, have additional things that are less relevant kind of minimized towards the bottom where you're really building out that content. Because of the 1 year of specialized experience, you do actually get, I think, in my opinion, a little bit more flexibility in, you know, where those like gaps are and how to display them because they really are looking to see where you have that experience. Now, maybe if it's 15, 20 years back, you might have some issues just with, what is the relevancy? Has technology changed? Have policies been updated? And that's where you're probably going to be, where are those transferable skills? Where am I demonstrating that I am? I have the toolbox necessary. I just need to be refreshed on, what the current policies are, different things like that. I think even for military spouses who have a lot more of those gaps in their resume, you have a great opportunity to just really highlight where you have that experience. And the federal government makes no distinction between what type of experience it is. It can be paid experience, it can be volunteer experience. It is all exactly the same as long as you can demonstrate the skills they're asking for. So just not limiting yourself or thinking that that gap is going to hurt you, but really just building out, this is what I can do. And you rearrange things and highlight those things as necessary. Slight segue. Everybody always asks me if they should do a USAJOBS builder versus an uploaded document. And this is one of those situations where that might determine which one you go with because the USAJOBS builder doesn't move sections around very easily. Maybe you just graduated from a university program. You want to highlight your education. You're really going to try and go for a recent graduate position. Put that at the top. You don't have that flexibility with USAJOBS builder, but you can build it in USAJOBS, print it as a PDF, convert it, move everything around that way. That way, hey, I've got all the required information, but I can, have that flexibility with that content.
Now, Kristen, I really want to ask because I've encountered this myself. So there's a questionnaire that usually comes up on USAJOBS, right? And when you're actually applying for it and the back end after you submit everything, it asks you to fill out a questionnaire, and it asks you whether or not you are an expert in this or not, or how much experience you have in each different thing, each different facet of the questionnaire. Does it hinder your chances of getting, I guess, the application pushed through if you put anything other than expert on there?
It can depend highly on the position itself. Some positions you're competing with a lot of people who have very similar backgrounds that if you're indicating you're not an expert in something, that might bump you further down. It could be that the position you're applying to has few applicants or few good applicants that they're taking, a broader selection of people who were referred over. Different questionnaires can have different flexibilities on the weight of each question. So sometimes, maybe if you're not indicating that you're an expert on one question, it's a very low weighted question anyway, and it might not affect you. But the biggest thing is make sure you give yourself credit. A lot of people get tripped up on the terminology of being an expert, because the federal government likes to use it at this GS level. If people are coming to ask you questions, you're the person that they're asking. You're an expert.
That's right.
If you've trained anybody, you're an expert. But if
Right.
you're not in the federal system, you tend to think an expert is somebody who's an industry-wide expert, a name in that field. That's not how they use that term expert. So I find people get tripped up on that question a couple of ways. And one of them is usually they're just like, well, I'm not the expert. Somebody knew more than me. That's not what they're asking.
Right.
They're
Right.
asking if at that level you are an expert. So give yourself credit. You want to ideally be an expert on all of those, but
Mhm.
not being an expert on every single one. It depends on the applicant pool. Unfortunately, we'll never fully know
Yeah.
what that applicant pool looks like, or which certificates maybe that you fall on, based on your eligibility and hiring pathways, things like that. They may or may not be looking at the same list. You might still be the top applicant on a list that they might not have pulled to interview.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've encountered that on like GS 14, 15 positions that I've tried to apply to, not really on like 12 and below. But I did find out that they, at like the 14 and 15 level, they actually make you do that questionnaire and like scenarios
Mhm.
as well. And I, I applied for one, and they'd asked me to reserve like an hour for a scenario. It was like timed. I couldn't finish it in time because I pressed OK, not reading the full thing, knowing that it was going to be timed, and I was at work, so I was getting tasked to do other things. So I'm like, oh crap! So I'm probably not going to get this job. Let me just zoom right through it. So, but yeah, that was after the questionnaire. So also be aware of that. Anybody is listening, you may get asked to answer some scenarios, and you have to make sure that you have time for that. Do you have any input on any of the scenarios or anything like that?
Yeah, so there's some announcements where they'll include like, hey, we might ask you to do additional something after the fact, or sometimes they'll make you take typing tests. If you're like an
Mhm.
admin or clerical position, you have to do one of it. Just makes me think of Mavis Beacon, um, back in school. But yeah, but sometimes you'll have to do those, especially when you get to the 14 and 15. Those are almost kind of entry level, training level positions for what will be SES positions. And if you're, so SES is Senior Executive Service. If you're, those are all of the positions that are above GS 15, but below political appointees, essentially. And they're very high level positions, and they require you to write essays, the executive core qualification essays, where you have to demonstrate how you did very high level work and how you worked across departments, things like that. So 14, 15 positions are essentially trying to gear you up for preparing those types of applications. So yeah, particularly in those 14, 15 positions, they're going to want to see those additional scenario-based essays. Essentially, they are essays. We do, so there is material that if you just kind of Google SES qualifications, OPM, something along that line, they'll give you a whole handbook of what you would need to do to prepare for those. They give you the typical ECQ questions. There's 4 or 5 of them. And it can kind of give you some direction or ability to plan for that ahead of time. These might not be the same scenario questions that you were facing, but it can
Mhm.
help at least prepare for answering some of those a little bit faster.
Yeah, I thought it made me feel like I was back in high school. It was like if Johnny has this and Mary has that,
Mhm.
how many people can they hire? Or if there's like problem-based scenario questions. And I'm unfortunately I was doing one thing and I'm trying to concentrate on this, not realizing it was timed. That was all on me. That was my fault. But no, that's good to know. I'm definitely going to Google that. And thank you, John, for bringing that up as well. I'm definitely going to look at that and make sure that I'm fully prepared for next time.
And you should be able to, I think, even like Google ECQ examples. There's usually
ECQ?
yeah, Executive Core Qualifications, ECQ.
Oh,
Um, yeah, sorry, federal has its own acronym. trip
You
myself
got
up there. Yeah, its own language. It's just like military language, but the all of the acronyms are different. It's very confusing.
Well, at least this is a 5-page document and not a 500-page document. So there's a plus on that side.
I'm okay with
Yeah,
that.
I think typically the ECQ essays, they want them to be between like 250 and 500 words. So it's not a, 10-page essay every time.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, and it's interesting that you said, I never heard it put that way before, like the 14 and 15 positions are like the entry-level positions to get into the FCS fields later on. That's an interesting perspective. It's like flipping the pyramid upside down kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it depends. So some of them, 14, 15 is going to be topping out. They're going to read it very similar to a 12, 13.
Mhm.
And then some of them, once you read through enough of them, you'll say, oh, okay, this language is actually starting to sound more like an SCS position language. Those are more likely to be kind of gearing you into those SCS positions.
Nice.
Now, Kristen, I want to ask, because this is something that I've been wondering for a long time, especially having applied to these positions myself and knowing folks who have applied, and trying to get through that barrier of entry in order to get that referral or that interview, essentially going to that next step, right? Is there an actual person scanning these resumes, or is it like a machine doing it, or how's that work exactly?
So there isn't, I think NASA was the longest holdout. I don't think
Mhm.
they use it anymore. They don't use ATS software as we would normally think about it.
Mhm.
So that occupational questionnaire is essentially that first hurdle you have to get through. So you have to indicate on your questionnaire, that you have X amount of qualifications to be at least minimally qualified. So you meet the qualifications for the job. And depending on how you answer that, because it starts with your eligibility questions, which is usually actually the first point that people trip themselves up. They're not eligible
Right.
to apply to the position, or maybe they haven't provided the documentation to prove that they can apply. Then you go through and you answer the questions, and then an HR specialist comes through and says, okay, you've indicated expertise, on X, Y, and Z thing. Where is it in your resume? And we need to see that in your resume, and they have every right, to say, hey, I don't see this in your resume. I'm removing, I'm changing your answer on this questionnaire. But essentially somebody goes through and says, is everything, validated by your resume? And that's how you get referred. But with the eligibility component, each of those different ways that you can be eligible essentially puts you on a different certificate, which is the federal government's fancy term for list. And so you end up on these different lists based on your eligibility, and those lists are then referred over to hiring managers who select a list or multiple lists, all lists, but the order and rankings are based on each individual list. And that's where they start selecting from who are they going to interview. Typically, they'll only start reaching out to maybe the top 2, 3, 4, 5, usually not beyond that, unless they need to go deeper into that list. But there's really not a computer involved in scanning your resume and anything like that. They try to keep that process easier by essentially your ratings on the occupational questionnaire are going to determine if they look at your resume or not.
Excellent. Yeah. So that was, I guess that was a myth that was going around then, because a lot of folks that I, at least from what I heard, yeah, if you don't have the keywords in there, they're not going to pass it through, right? Or they're not going to hire you, essentially.
Yeah, so it's not scanned like that. USAJOBS actually used to have that on their website at the very bottom of the main page. It was like myth. A computer doesn't scan it. It's based on your responses to this questionnaire. I think they said
Yeah.
true and false because of that portion. Based on your responses, the computer system will determine, do you meet this qualified standpoint? So if you're
Mhm.
not indicating that you're qualified, a computer will not even move it over to an HR specialist because you've indicated that you're not qualified based on the standards that they have uploaded into their system.
Gotcha.
They just did a redesign of USAJOBS last week, 2 weeks ago. So it looks a little bit different now. That myth part is still there. It's just hidden now. It's no longer on the main page.
Yeah. So I've been seeing a lot, especially like I lurk around Facebook a lot, around these groups, just reading comments and things like that. I'm sure a ton of people do the same exact, especially if they're looking for like federal positions. And I came across a post the other day, a gentleman mentioning like he's been looking for federal work for a year and he can't get his foot in the door. What is he doing wrong? And I was reading the comments and they're like, oh, keywords, this and that. And somebody had mentioned that they checked to see if there was a direct hire, like if they already have somebody in mind. Is there any way to check on that or to know if they have somebody in mind already?
So that's a whole rabbit hole in itself.
Yeah.
Everybody gets really caught up on the idea that they have somebody in mind for a position, and maybe they
Mhm.
do. But that's the reality across the board. It's not specific to the federal government. And the federal government, they're still required to post the position. They're still required to have to go through the steps. Um, they're still required to, do, and the applicant would then still be required to go through that whole process too. So where things like direct hire comes into place, and people do get mad about direct hire, they have to get that signed off by OPM. So OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, who oversees all of the HR for the federal government, has to sign off and say that there is an urgent hiring need, or maybe they're not getting enough applicants to have a truly competitive process. There's a couple different ways, but they have to get that signed off by OPM. But essentially what it does is it makes their hiring a little bit more flexible. So instead of, before you had to be qualified, but then you're kind of put into buckets of qualified, well qualified, best qualified, or qualified or best qualified. It's just one big bucket of you've met the qualifications, veterans preference is not applied, and then they just refer over all of the applications essentially to the hiring manager, or whatever that predetermined, I would like you to send these over. So it's easier for people to get through that process because they've suspended a lot of the intricacies of it. If you have hiring authorities like VRA, which is a non-competitive appointing authority, it can make that a little bit easier on top of that. But even with VRA, it doesn't necessarily need to have a direct hire in order to leverage that. So there are different ways to like navigate through that process. But just because it is a direct hire doesn't mean that they have somebody picked out for the position. Just because it's a short time frame doesn't mean that they have somebody selected for that position. It's really hard actually to look at an announcement and say they do or do not have somebody selected for that position. Sometimes it's just they get an overwhelming number of applications. You'll see some that say, hey, we'll be open for a week or until we receive 150 applications, and then it closes the next day. That's just how many applications that they got. But if they are required to post it, applicants are required to go through the process. They still have to go through that process. If somebody has, access to some of these hiring authorities, they can take advantage of those. But they're not alone. Other people can also take advantage of those. They still have to end up on that certificate. A lot of those processes still do have to apply. So I would never say use that as a reason to not apply to a position. I know it can be frustrating because it's just a longer process, just more that's involved. But yeah, I know a lot of people do get frustrated by that. And sometimes it's not even that you're not the person that they had in mind for that position. Sometimes you're just tripping up on the eligibility requirements or demonstrating your qualifications. A big thing that happens is people will make assumptions. There's language on a lot of it. We will not make assumptions on your behalf, but when you're working in that every single day, it's really easy to forget what is an assumption that you're making. And that happens more often than not. We've worked with clients who are just very frustrated, not getting through the process. They think, everything's against them. All of the positions have somebody selected, and lo and behold, they're just not elaborating enough on their resume. to really demonstrate that they're qualified.
Yeah, and as far as that goes, like, are there some key places on the USA? And I've got mine pulled up if you need it for a reference or anything, or want to put it on the screen. But I'm free to put my information out there to the world. I don't care. Are there any specific things that you would point people to and be like, hey, this is the Mount Rushmore of things that you should be looking for on a job announcement to make sure that you are paying attention to the things that actually are going to make or break you from getting your resume and getting applied and picked for this job? Things that people regularly miss when they're scanning the different job announcements.
Yeah, the three big ones. Eligibility. I know I've kind of harped on that a little bit, but it's huge. I've worked with a lot of people. Like, I'm perfectly qualified. Why am I not hearing back? It's like, well, the 3 positions you sent me are all recent graduate positions, and you haven't finished your degree yet. And it stipulates you have to have that finished by the time that you're by the time the deadline for the position is. Something like that. Or the qualification section is a big one. And the part that trips people up there is normally they look at duties. Duties are at the top of the position. You scan through them. You're like, oh, this job sounds perfect for me. You never really get further down the screen to where the qualifications are. And so with qualifications, you have the 1 year of specialized experience where you must include hours per week. A lot of the time they'll say you only need to include it if it's part-time, but just to cover all bases, just always put hours per week. The average number of hours per week, you don't get more credit for going over 40. So yeah, just making sure that you have that. They do calculate 1 year, particularly if you're not full-time. They sit down and calculate it.
And that's a requirement, isn't it, for a federal resume, the hours on the resume? Okay.
Yeah, that is that one, and month and year date range. They can be flexible about some of the other ones, like your supervisor information. That's a best practice. If you don't include it, you're not automatically chucked out of the pile. It's there to verify employment, not to get a reference. So you can use an HR contact. I know that that's sometimes harder for people, as you go further back in commands and things, people move on. But if you can't include it, you're not automatically disqualified because of that. Salary information, they're actually moving away from that. So it's kind of unclear where that is going to still be included moving forward. They passed I believe it was an executive order last year saying that you can't use that in negotiation anymore. So it's time on the resume may be short-lived now. But that one's been optional for a while, and clearly optional. They have it in parentheses and everything. It's optional. But yeah, so making sure that you're following those qualifications, and usually under the how you'll be evaluated section, they'll include a few other just competencies that play together with that specialized experience requirement. But that's where they're looking to see, do you meet these qualifications? And the big difference between the duties and the qualifications is that the duties can be that position at its full operating capacity. So if it's a position that maybe has promotion potential in it, the duties might be that position at the highest promotion potential, or that could be that position after probation. It's things that you would like to include in your resume if you have them, but they're not necessarily what you're going to be evaluated for. And then that occupational questionnaire you mentioned, a lot of the time you're able to preview it. If you're able to preview it, do it. I usually use that as like these are the questions I'm going to ask myself to include in my resume. And if you can answer all of those questions with content in your resume, you have a very well-tailored resume. But those are the 3 big things. I mean, there's a lot of boilerplate stuff that they always have to include. There's a lot of specifications on different resume things, or if they want you to include a cover letter or not. All of there's just so much information on a job announcement. But those 3 big sections, as you're kind of putting your resume together, are the ones that you should focus in on. And I did want to actually make a mention about keywords, because there is a way that you can use keywords to your advantage. You're not being scanned by a
Oh, please
system.
do tell.
But so essentially when like me or my team goes through a resume, we use that specialized experience requirement and the competencies. Sometimes the competencies are really well designed. Sometimes they're very vague, like ingenuity. Like how do you use that as a keyword very well? But you can use those as essentially these keyword headers. And what we will do is essentially use those to organize your content. So we just put them directly into your resume. We align the content that's there in your resume already with these keyword headers, because these keywords are what HR is looking for. And you can kind of think of HR as they're specialized in the human resources practice. So they know about that position is what is in this job announcement. So using keywords that they're already looking at, and then using the occupational questionnaire to essentially ask yourself those questions of, am I addressing these things almost like I would in an interview? And that right there is just your cheat sheet study guide, whatever you want to call it, for going through your resume and answering the questions. If you aren't able to preview the occupational questionnaire, you can apply to the position and then submit a new application, and they will use the most recent one received. So you can essentially go through the application to get the occupational questionnaire if you're unable to preview it, and then resubmit. And so I'm really good at long answers.
No, that's perfect. And the more information, the better, I think, especially for anybody else watching. And for me, because I'm trying to get my foot in the door too, and I've been trying for a long time, and it seems to get kicked back every time. So I'm definitely going to pick your brain there, Kristen. You see, I wrote down a couple questions based on what we were talking about earlier. We were talking about series, right? Like having the master resume for the series early on. Is it, once you're in that system, right? Once you're in the federal system, is it hard to jump from one series to another? Like if I was, I don't know, HR, I keep using HR because that's what's fresh in my mind. But if I was going from HR to, I don't know, what's another series out there? Maybe
2210,
legal, right? Yeah, whatever 2210 is. If
computer science,
if I was going from computer science, which I'm not going to be doing, John, but if I was going to jump, is that tough to jump from one series to another, or are you constricted to your series, and that's the only upper or way to go up?
It can very much depend on the position. It can depend on the agency. So if you're looking at human resources, even within human resources, there's the difference between a human resources specialist and a human resources assistant. And going between those two, you can't internally. You would essentially have to apply as an external candidate and use non-federal experience to do that, because essentially an assistant track is, if you look at this is one of those things I'm sure that everybody hates about it because it's just so confusing. But some positions will have a one-step ladder, and you'll see, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then some positions will be a two-step ladder, which will be 5, 7, 9, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. So who learned how to count? I don't know. But moving between those positions, because of how you qualify for each one, the qualifications for an assistant will never allow you to qualify for a specialist. So you would have to highlight other experience, but you can't then use, we actually had somebody on our team at one point, she was applying to a federal position. She had previously had federal experience. To apply or to be eligible, she had to apply as an internal candidate, but it was for a 9 position, and she had been a 6 position previously. She was not allowed to do that. Essentially, she was deemed disqualified because to be internal, she did not have that experience to make that jump and to kind of switch that way.
So you're restricted then. Like you can't jump it if you're like a 6 trying to go to a 9, but you have the experience of a 9 because you maybe have gone to school or something, or on your own time. you would be only restricted to go to the 7, or I mean, if that exists, 7 or 8, the next one up. Okay.
So yeah, that's where the eligibility component's really important, because if you're trying to apply internally, you're limited in what experience you can use to qualify. She could have qualified for that, and she did qualify based on her experience, but she wasn't eligible as, you know, an open to the public position.
Yeah.
Because it was only internal. So that's where it's interesting of getting your foot in the door can sometimes restrict you in how you can navigate it. So it kind of depends on the position that you're looking at, the agency. You know, if you're moving from HR to 2210, if you find a position that maybe that's not the best, but maybe from like an HR to
Maybe like a program analyst or something like that.
program analyst, or, you know, my favorite positions are the 0025, the park rangers, because almost every position in some capacity is usually also falls under a park ranger position. And it's just due to the nature of how that position needs to operate in those agencies. You can be somebody who's an education specialist as park ranger, or an education specialist in Department of Defense schools. Department of Defense schools probably are not going to tap you for emergency search and rescue situations. That's why they're categorized differently. But you could use your experience to qualify, because you meet that specialized experience requirement at that level in a way. You could be limited based on, again, eligibilities if it's limited to just the agency. Sometimes there are interchange agreements, which would allow you to move more easily. It depends on the positions, the agencies, all of that stuff.
Yeah, and that's where diving into those, actually going to the OPM site and looking up the codes is what gives you the kind of the secret sauce of what they're actually talking about for the position itself, eligibility requirements and all that stuff. And some of that stuff is actually pertinent for the resume as well, or no?
It can give you an overview of what you would need to demonstrate. A lot of the time they're very generally written, so they're not incredibly helpful, but it can give you a good idea of, as you move up in GS levels, like what that change in experience is going to look like. There can be multiple different positions that fall under like the broad umbrella of the series, so it can break it down of like, here are all the things that fall within this job series, how they're kind of different, what the education might look like that'd be different, or the experience that might be different. And then they'll have them also broken down in certain places by, you know, blue collar jobs, white collar jobs. They do still call them that. And, you know, what kind of falls under these different professional series, professional categories, things like that. There's a whole OPM like series handbook where it has everything kind of listed out. You can just Google it. And I say that because I frequently forget where it is, and I just Google OPM series handbook, and it's the first thing that pops up.
Yeah.
But it does provide a lot of information. It also gives you a good idea of just the number of series that are out there and the number of things that you could potentially look at. And it's kind of interesting how a lot of things will fall under multiple series. A big one that I've kind of come across a couple of times as they only have one series for anything computer science related, which is very limiting to people who are in the computer science industry. They think, what's happening? And as somebody from the outside looking at it, there's kind of two different types of data analysts. In industry, you kind of have a more program analyst, data analyst position, and who's looking at, you know, evaluating the efficacy of programs, things like that. And then you have the computer science data analyst who's looking at the architecture and usage of data and how it comes together, and is the data valid? And sometimes that can fall under the 2210 series. And I've seen a couple of times where it's actually been falling under the 343 series as well. And you kind of just have to look at the terminology, or I came across one that was in 343 that had the boilerplate language of a computer science position of you have to have customer service, problem solving, the little 4 that's on every single 2210 position. Like that was an interesting thing, that you're kind of seeing them go across some of those series to best fill the position and find better candidates.
Right.
obviously I spend too much time on USAJOBS, but it is an asset to kind of figure out where are these positions? Are they where you expect them to be? Are they sometimes popping up in places that make sense, but you don't necessarily expect them to be? That's always the first thing I tell people. If you don't know what you're looking for, just go explore, go play with filters, play with locations, play with agencies, like just go down that rabbit hole of what looks interesting, what looks awful. It's going to help you figure out where the best place for you is, because each agency has its own mission. They apply that mission in the way that makes sense to them. So a position will ultimately be the same, but applied a little bit differently in different agencies. It's not one giant monolith like we tend to think it is.
Now, what would you suggest after you apply? Suggest contacting the hiring manager just to kind of introduce yourself or anything like that? Sometimes I see the names at the bottom. I've done it a couple of times. I never really hear back, but I figured, let me just introduce myself. Maybe not everybody's doing that. Would you suggest that, or is there any advantage to that?
That's hard. So because like there can be advantage in like having your name stick out if you end up on those certificates. But again, the challenge is that's the HR person, not the hiring manager,
not the hiring
most
team.
of the time.
Yeah.
And so the hiring manager is the person you really want to be reaching out to in those situations, and not the HR specialist. They're kind of more there if you're having issues, or if you say didn't make it to the hiring manager, but you think that you're best qualified and you think something went wrong there, you can contest that. There are ways to kind of reach out to hiring managers or try to find them on LinkedIn. A lot of them are on LinkedIn. So, networking on LinkedIn is still something that is highly recommended. You just have to be careful in the application process to not present any information that can be biasing to that process.
Right.
So things like pictures, things like that. That's why you shouldn't include those on your federal resume. But yeah, LinkedIn would probably be a better way. It's not a bad thing necessarily to reach out to an HR specialist, but it's probably not going to influence your application one way or another.
Yeah, well, that's good to know.
And how would you go about actually looking for, because I know a few that are out there on LinkedIn that are hiring managers for different agencies, but if you were just trying to get your feet wet and trying to figure out and navigate this thing from the beginning, and maybe it's something in one of the charts that you gave me and we can pull it up and talk to it. But if you're trying to figure out who those hiring officials are, or trying to find people, are there some specific keywords that you search for on LinkedIn to find those things?
For me, I would typically start more at the agency level. I would try to hone in on, what agencies am I trying to target? Where would I really want to work? For me, it'd probably be National Park Service. So I would start there, follow them on LinkedIn, who's posting things, who's kind of active within the National Park Service, and just follow kind of your normal networking of reaching out to people, saying, "Hey, I'm really interested in these types of positions. Maybe I see that they're very cyclical. Is this something that typically gets announced at this time of year, or are you guys looking for it at different times? Whatever you find that you're asking questions about would be a big way to start with that. There's actually something that I don't know how many people know about. So Feds Hire Vets is an absolutely amazing website. They just did a redesign of that last November, I believe it was. So it's now housed under the OPM websites, but there is a link on that website for the Veterans Council. I can't remember if it's on this main page or if you go under job seekers. But essentially, they give you contacts within different agencies to help you. It might be that agency directory, but there should be contacts there for HR or different people who are kind of tasked within each agency to be that point of contact. They have different job searches, people that you can reach out to. That's also a really good place to get started with kind of networking. They're there to kind of help you navigate and get into those agencies. That's their job. So that's also just a really good place to kind of get started.
Now go ahead and throw this up on the screen for those paying attention or keeping track, keeping score. Yeah, this is great. I've never actually. You must do a lot of digging on OPM, and you do have a slight advantage. You have a slight like an IT kind of background, an analytical background to begin with, right? So I guess maybe
I think it's cultivated more than anything. No, I think if I can give anybody 2 places to get started, dig around in USAJOBS, dig around on Feds Hire Vets. Those are going to be your 2 just biggest resources, because they both link to other agencies, government sites to get you that information. There's so much information on USAJOBS that nobody ever thinks to look at because you just go there to look for jobs. It's a job board. It's the federal government's job board. You don't realize that there's links in there that walk you through what the application process looks like, what to expect at different stages of the process. If you're not getting through, they have some troubleshooting things for both the website and what might be happening. They have articles about what working in the federal government's like. There's so much information. Like if we do a webinar, the whole webinar is just, we're going to go through USAJOBS. We're going to spend a whole hour just going through USAJOBS. We're going to play with positions. We're going to go through the help desk, FAQs, all of that. There's just so much information there.
That's excellent. I had no idea any of that stuff existed. I was literally just going on USAJOBS and putting search and my location, and I thought that was it. And I played around with like the resume builder at one point, and I just didn't like the way it looked. So I built my own resume to kind of mimic that. But I had no idea that all this stuff existed, like even the webinars, or it makes sense to kind of get into it, into the weeds on what exactly you want to get into. If you want to jump into a federal position, it makes sense to learn as much as you can on how the structure works. So I appreciate you sharing all that information, Kristen. That's awesome.
USAJOBS has its own events page too, where OPM's hosting webinars, where they're giving you, it's general information. I'm going to say it that way because OPM, is kind of the broad umbrella. Each agency can make more specific requirements about their resume process. But OPM's posting things for how to build a resume or how to interview. They're very good. Each agency will do hiring events, either virtually or in person. Typically, most summers, you'll see the Secret Service do a few recruitment webinars just to get people interested. The Forest Service usually does a couple of things towards the beginning of the year before they ramp up for their summer hiring. So if you're interested in those things, just always keep checking back. There's usually multiple things every week where they're trying to get more applicants, more people interested, more people aware of that process. Yeah, there's so much, and some of it can be more or less detailed, but they usually connect you over to other websites. The hiring pathways, if you go under veterans, it gives you an overview of veterans preference, some of the other hiring authorities that you have access to as a veteran, but it also connects you over to Feds Hire Vets to give you more in-depth information. So there's just such a treasure trove there that it's always disappointing to me that more people don't know about. But I'm a dork. I spend way too much time on USAJOBS.
Now, you know what? Let's all be dorks. Let's all spend time on this because we all need to know how it works.
Well, another weird
Kristen,
secret thing, the control number on every announcement, if you have that, you can always get back to that announcement. Every single USAJOBS URL is the same, and just the numbers at the end are the control number.
Yeah, I find that I'm always going back to the control number when I'm submitting was SF15, I think it is. And you always have to put that new control number on there. It keeps it fresh in the mind.
Yeah, that control number is surprisingly helpful.
Yeah. Go back to it. Now, Kristen, I want to ask you a question, and I know we talked a lot about what we should be doing, right, with this whole federal hiring and resumes. Can you give us any information or even stories on what not to do when applying or searching for a federal position?
Don't put your social security number. Don't put a picture. Don't include your
Excellent.
LinkedIn. There's usually a little list of a few things like that on announcements. The biggest
Okay.
thing is that everything, or they're trying to control for bias in a lot of situations. In a lot of situations that frustrate people, it's because you're maybe running into one of these walls where they're trying to control for, making sure that everybody has an equal opportunity to compete for a position. So if you're including a photo, you're immediately disqualified. That LinkedIn has part of that because of the photo, but then also it can be a security risk depending on the agency that you're applying to as well. Things like that will immediately get you kicked out most of the time,
Yeah.
just because
I can
it's
imagine.
introducing bias into this process. Oh, I had one, but I just lost it. I'm sorry.
No, we'll come back to it. That's fine.
Yeah,
I just
it's
figured
amazing we've made it this far without me losing my train of thought once. So,
hey, you know what happens to me like all the time? John put on some music here not too long ago, and immediately I was talking about something. He turned on the soft background music, and I completely like blanked out. And yeah, you remember that, John? He's over there laughing about it. So completely blanked out, and I'm like, okay, well, let's turn that off. And then that's why I write everything down. Everything you've been saying. I'm writing books on everything you're saying, Kristen.
oh, I
No,
remembered it
but
though.
yeah. Okay, go ahead. Do your thing.
The 180-day restriction. I'm
Okay.
sure you guys have heard about this.
Oh yeah.
Yep.
The biggest thing that I feel like people do wrong is when they retire, they don't apply for positions because they think that they can't for 6 months. Apply. So the 180-day waiver or the restriction is specific to retirees who are going into DoD, only DoD.
Okay.
And it's there to essentially limit nepotism. So essentially, you walk out, you don't have to go through that competitive process. You can be appointed to this position, and it inhibits other people who have been working in the agency to be promoted, different things like that. So what it doesn't do, it does not prohibit you from applying. It does not prohibit you from being selected for an interview. It does not even prohibit you from being selected for that position. They just have to submit for a waiver that says you are the best qualified candidate. So at no point should that even really come into your consideration of should I go through this application process? And especially when the federal government, that's why I sent you all those numbers. Like military affiliated programs is 35%. Not all of that is DoD. So even all of that is not necessarily affected by that.
So like DOL, Department of Labor, and
DOL, the Veteran
Human
Affairs.
Services.
Veteran Affairs is not even covered by that. So you can go as a retiree directly into Veterans Affairs and not have to worry about a single part of that. Homeland Security, same thing. Coast Guard people do get a little frustrated because like, well, we're not in DoD, we're in Homeland Security, but it's military personnel, not DoD military personnel. Unfortunately, it does still apply to them, but only going into DoD. Department of Labor, National Park Service, USDA, CDC, any other agency out there is not affected by that.
No, that's good to know. That's great information, especially for the folks that watch our channel here who are going to be retiring soon, because that's something that wasn't covered in my outgoing processing, like the TRS, Transition Readiness Service. We had a class on federal hiring, but they didn't mention. I don't think they mentioned anything about applying directly to like Department of Labor or anything outside of Department of Defense, right? They just mentioned, hey, there is a 6-month waiver that could be put in place if you're going to be applying for a federal position, but just know that you have 6 months where you can't apply. And that kind of caused me to go outside of, the federal hiring realm and look at like contracting, looking at private organizations and things like that. Had I had known that prior to, I would have been applying to different federal organizations or like things outside DoD, basically on USAJOBS. That's great information, Kristen.
Yeah, it was something that had been place prior to 9/11. They
Mhm.
suspended it because of 9/11 and the ramp up with that. And I believe it was around, I can't remember if it was 2018 or 2019 now. They said, we've kind of moved out of this phase. We're putting that waiver back in place. But yeah, and then everybody panicked. They're like, what does
Yep.
this mean?
And then
they're like,
COVID happened.
Yeah. And then,
Yep.
you can't do this, you can't do that. And that's not true. You have a lot more flexibility that doesn't limit you from applying, and it doesn't limit you in any capacity outside of DoD.
Yeah. It's just another extra piece of paper that you got to have too. I think if I remember correctly, it's like a little waiver memo that you have to get from your commander or whatever, who it is.
Well,
when you're
use
still
the
on active duty.
applicant. Don't have to do anything. The command itself is all responsible for that. So you as the applicant don't even have to worry about getting that.
Really? I thought there was because I know when I was applying at least a year before I got off active duty, and I at some point saw that, and I was like, okay, well, I need to get this waiver letter or whatever. So I just had the memo printed up, and I had my commander sign it, and I uploaded it with my documents because I thought
That's a statement of service. So
okay.
as an applicant, you can't use veterans preference within until you're within a 120-day window of separating. So they have to upload a statement of service saying that you will be getting out at this point.
Got it. So that's something totally different.
Yeah, it's equally confusing because they use 120 and 180 days to describe it, but it's kind of like the SF50 and the SF15.
Right.
Two very similar sounding forms that apply to people who are applying to federal jobs.
See, John, I thought that the command was making you do all the legwork. We don't want to do this waiver, so you're going to do your own waiver, John.
I was already in the groove of just putting together all the paperwork possible to get things going. So that was one of the ones I was like, okay, got that one checked off the block. So
yeah, you'll need that if you don't have your DD 214 yet.
Right.
Okay,
that's right.
So Kristen, real quick, I know John, you mentioned COVID, and that kind of started the spike of remote work. Do you have any information on remote work, Kristen? Whether like it's going to be going away or even telework, right? Do you have any information on that?
Well, it is constantly up for debate. I don't think that there's a week that I don't receive an email saying like this new proposed something has gone before Congress, but so far there's not a lot of definitive anything. From people who are not related to Congress, I think they want it to stay. The redesign for USAJOBS last week actually highlighted remote work more than it ever had been before. So before it was in the location, you could type in remote and not accidentally click on remote Oregon, which happened to me a couple of times. But if you have to type all of remote and then it's, include only remote positions or exclude all remote positions. But now there's a filter that they've built into the agency GS level filters that are on the side to select for remote positions. You can even, I had somebody give me this tip, if it's, a location negotiable position, you could potentially negotiate for remote in those positions as well. Even if they're not listed as a remote potential position. There's different things like that. It's unclear if it's going to go anywhere. They saw a lot, especially in the last year, 2 years, with just the uncertainty in different industries. A lot of younger people are actually starting to look at federal in higher numbers than they had in the last 5-10 years because they want the stability. And if remote is an option, it's a very lucrative option. So it's unclear kind of at this point because a lot of people are pushing everybody to go back to offices. There's a lot of money being spent on offices that are not being used at this point.
Right.
But there's also the continuing demand of the applicants to say, I will be interested in this if remote is an option. So
I guess the government has to kind of weigh that out a little bit, right? It's like, do we want the best qualified who is willing to be remote, or do we want to settle for somebody else who is not the best qualified, but they're willing to come in office, right? And I have to believe that there's like a ton of competition for remote jobs out there. Like if you're applying, you're not the only one applying for that job. It's got to be thousands of people applying for remote jobs.
Yeah. There's more people applying for them because location's not a factor. You
Yeah.
can get more qualified people because they don't have to be in that area, so it makes hiring a little bit more competitive.
And does USA Jobs show you like the amount of people that are applying?
No, not typically.
Okay.
The most you would really get is if it's, limited to 150 applications, how quickly that position
Okay.
would close.
Yeah. 'Cause
There is
like,
some
for instance,
cool.
like, go ahead.
No, sorry, I was going to say there's some cool stats on USA Jobs that they just uploaded when they did the redesign a week or two ago. If you scroll down to the bottom, it kind of tells you like how many people are on USA Jobs, how many people.
Like how many people are actively on USA Jobs
Yeah, how
live?
many positions are available? How many positions are posted? It might be in the help center somewhere.
I did not
Wherever you
know
want me
that.
to go.
Yeah, go to the help center.
Mhm.
I know I came across it at the bottom of a page. I just don't remember about USA Jobs. Actually, if you click on About USA Jobs and scroll down, yeah, those numbers.
Nice.
1,200 jobs are posted every day. On average, there's about almost 28,500 positions, over 6 million active users. How many? So those are some cool numbers that they didn't have up before, or at least as easily accessible. No, it's not quite the same, but
I can't
a
wait
lot
till
of
the
people.
YouTube channel looks like this.
No.
that'll be awesome. No, that's awesome, and they have redesigned it a lot. I go on here quite frequently, and there's a lot of new stuff on here that I didn't realize that they had just updated it.
Yeah, we had done our USA Jobs webinar. It'll be about 3 weeks ago, 2.5 weeks ago. And then by the time we were preparing for the one that we did this past week, they had already done the redesign. I was like,
Changed
well,
the
don't
slide.
worry. Yeah. But I'm sorry. I think I cut you off, Victor.
I forgot what I was going to say, Kristen. It's one of those things, right? Yeah. There you go. Okay. No, I'm just kind of going down my list here because I'm writing. There's a ton of good information, and I appreciate you kind of giving us all the insight on that stuff because there's a ton of stuff that I didn't know about USA Jobs. I mean, look at the stats you just showed us. I had no idea that existed, and that kind of scares me now because I know there's a ton of competition out there. So, like oh yeah, that's what I was going to ask for remote jobs. God damn it! It just went away again. Never mind.
That's okay. I got
John,
you. I got your back. As far as remote jobs are concerned, right? I've looked and looked and looked, and I don't know if maybe there's a certain box I got to tick or some kind of filter that I got to apply. But have you seen anything? Maybe it's not even something that's in your purview, but have you seen any of the remote jobs that list anything other than within the United States for location?
There are some. I think it depends on the agency that you're looking at. So if you're looking in DoD, you're more likely to find it. State Department, you're more likely to find those. Probably
for like the embassy positions, you mean?
Embassy positions. There could be a few. I think the Treasury has some overseas positions.
Interesting.
Yeah, the Treasury is actually a surprisingly fascinating agency because that's where the Secret Service also lives.
Okay.
So, they have like a dual role of protecting important people and investigating financial fraud. Two things that I would not have put together, but the Treasury has some really interesting work that way. When it comes to citizenship and immigration, I think that they have more international, but different things like the National Park Service, CDC, USDA, more of those things are going to be limited to the US. They might have a few international, but that's going to be far more based on individual agencies than anything else.
Okay.
But they do exist because I know we do work with military spouses who are looking at different options. But yeah, a lot of the time, and it just kind of, I think, comes down to if the agency themselves have the capacity to deal with international taxation.
Right.
I think is a big thing.
Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, they definitely hire in-person positions, multiple different agencies, whether it's U.S. Department of U.S. Navy or the Department of the Army or the Air Force or anything like that, plus DoD schools, so
Mhm.
DoDEA, a couple other agencies, like you mentioned with the Department of, not the DOJ, but the ones who manage the embassies and things like that, State Department. So yeah, they definitely hire in person. I haven't found one yet that says anything that's remotely close to like, yeah, you can work remote, but you can also live overseas working remote. So I didn't know if you came across anything like that.
Yeah, those tend to be more difficult, just also based on time change, um, and like working hours, things like that. Because most things for the federal government, especially I'm sure if you're looking at announcements, it's all based on an East Coast midnight time for closing dates and things like that. So everything's kind of based around Washington,
Yeah.
and the flexibility they have to work around that time.
And I want to go ahead and I'm going to bring this chart up because it's very interesting. It's got a lot of detail in it, and I know you're a detail junkie. So let me just bring this particular slide up and take a look at it. And maybe you
This is
can
my
walk us
favorite
through.
thing.
Maybe you can walk us through this and
This
just
slide?
give us kind of.
Yeah, so this is the flowchart. I love flowcharts, for the competitive examining process. So there's a whole handbook for HR specialists who are putting together job announcements called the Delegated Examiner's Handbook. And this is the flowchart of how everything goes in that book. But I like to use this to highlight just one, how kind of convoluted the system is a bit. So,
Mhm.
as an applicant, you feel like if it's not working out, there something's wrong, something's, you're not doing something right, somebody's screwing up somewhere else, but there is kind of a level of patience and understanding that kind of needs to go into this process also. Um, and so on the left side, you'll see those boxes with red words. The first two happen entirely before you're able to apply to it, to apply to an announcement. So a lot of things are happening. And so if you also see the gray shaded boxes, those are the points in the process that a hiring manager is involved. So they're involved prior to putting the announcement together. So who are we looking for? Making sure HR is aware of that. And then they're involved in the selection. Everything else is done by an HR specialist who is not particularly familiar with the backgrounds of people involved, maybe not an industry expert. That's where that making sure that we're not making assumptions, because they might not have the background to even make that assumption. But we forget a lot of the time that based on our job title, we're automatically assuming that somebody's going to make an assumption about what we did in this job based on this job title. And they can't do that. So just kind of being a little bit more explicit. But then when you go through, you can see that before you even get to the qualifications, so like that third little red box and the things kind of past it, all of that stuff is based on eligibility. So before they will even consider you to be qualified, you have to demonstrate that you're somebody who's allowed to apply to this position. And I know I've said that a couple of times, but I'm going to keep harping home about that because that really does get a lot of people. You're just not eligible to apply to these positions. The VA is a big one. They have a lot of entry level positions for you to get into the VA. BSR and WARTAC program being a big one that people like to take advantage of. But most of their higher level positions are internal to agency. So if you're not in the VA or sometimes even in that specific VA hospital, you're not eligible to apply.
Yeah.
And so, that's a big thing. It doesn't matter at first if you're even qualified before you might be kicked out of that process. But then making sure that you are using your eligibility, use all of your eligibilities. Some people ask me, well, should I use this one over this one? I'm like, if you have both, use both. It gets you on multiple lists at that point. You kind of, not only are you just being competitive with your qualifications, but you're being competitive on the number of certificates that you might have access to. So if they're only pulling one of them and there's 5 different certificates, if you can be on 3 of them, it increases your chances that they might be pulling the one certificate that you're on. And then kind of going through that, a lot of things happen that the hiring manager just doesn't have control over. So that's where it's, if you feel like somebody's, like an announcement is written for somebody in particular, maybe it is, but if they have to announce it, they still have to go through a lot of this process. That applicant still has to go through this process. There's a lot of places for them to fall through the cracks. There's a lot of places for you to excel, where maybe they don't. So I really do just love this flowchart because I like flowcharts, but also it kind of just, it's crazy from an external point of view. It's crazy from an internal point of view. But also just recognizing that there's a lot of things happening. And so we want to make sure that we put in the best effort we can in our resume, but not getting hung up on just, one position or, one specific instance or iteration of this process. We're going to control what we can control for, and then we're going to move on to the next one and control what we can control for. And I say that because we do get a lot of people come to us and we make them write a lot more than they're used to writing.
Right.
My buddy didn't have to do this. And I'm like, yeah, he might not have had to, but we need to control for everything that we can control for, and then accept the things that we can't, move on to the next one and control what we can control for, to make sure that we're as competitive as we can be.
Yeah, and you'd mentioned that the federal resume itself, like there's more room and you're more apt to write like the backup story and kind of like the context to the actual accomplishments that are on your resume and to the bullet points that you're speaking to on the resume. So it's not just like, oh yeah, I did these things and I led these teams and I, saved the government this much money. Like there's room to put that context in the background. So when the hiring manager or whoever's reviewing the resume can go and look at it, especially if they're not somebody who's specifically tuned to that job field or that job path, then they have a little bit more back material that they can actually then put 2 and 2 together and say, okay, cool, this makes sense. They did this and this and this, and this is how they accomplished it, and this is what some of the outcomes were, and these are some of the the details of the actual job description for that particular qualifying job blurb on the resume.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and that's a big thing, especially because looking at resumes for like 10 years now, you don't really realize how much when you put like logistics specialist and then you start putting on, oversaw, the movement of, so much, material, whatever it was that you were taking care of in that position. As somebody who's familiar with that, like, oh, okay, I get what you did, and then maybe talk about a specific process that you're familiar with or you're an expert in. And you completely overlook the fact that, there's a lot of things that you're doing in that situation that one could be transferable skills if you don't have that specific like automated system, or transferable skills to a different process. But there's also just a lot that you do to mitigate problems and issues that you don't think to include in your resume, that really do help bolster your federal resume, to make that the connections, connect the dots is what we normally call it, but to really highlight the expertise that you have and how you're going to be a good fit coming in. Because if you don't put it in your resume and an interview is less personalized, where are they going to get how you're uniquely able to come in and be a good team member? And it's really kind of providing some of this additional context to what it is that you did, how you did it, and maybe why you did it in a different way that makes your approach a unique one that will benefit them. So it's to your own advantage to provide a little bit more context and detail and some of those, specific details and things like that. Because not everybody's approach is the same, and kind of showing how yours is just a little bit different might be that thing that puts you above somebody else.
Yeah, I've noticed a lot of folks, even on LinkedIn, talking about how you should expand on these resumes just by putting something like oversaw a team of this and just keeping it at that.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really help out, right? Because it's kind of like, what does oversaw mean? You're just kind of sitting back and saying, good job, you did it right. I mean, what exactly does that mean, right? But getting kind of into weeds on explaining what exactly your role was as a director, manager, supervisor, etc., on things. I mean, would you agree with that, or how far do we expand on that? Include numbers, include exactly what you did, as far as contributed to the team. How far in the weeds do we go on that?
I like to tell people, think about it more like an interview question.
Mm-hmm.
So how would you address that in an interview? So if you need to provide just a little bit more context so that they're with you in that story, that you address this kind of problem and you had this, it's not so detailed that you're
Right.
opening yourself up to different rabbit holes as you go through that process.
Yeah.
You still want it to be focused, but you still want to make sure that you're not making an assumption that they might misinterpret. So I think a lot of the time it's one of those where it's going to be kind of unique, depending
Yeah.
on the situation. And it could be that depending on the position you're looking at and you're using to apply, one scenario might be you might be able to address almost all of the occupational questionnaire questions, and so that you can build it out and then almost build on top of the initial scenario, so that you're adding more details to it. It depends also on your writing style. Not everybody writes the same way. I'm a very concise writer. It's hard for me to write very long-winded sentences, which is amazing because I can just talk that way. But I can't write that way. And so for me, it's kind of, I need to make sure I at least set up a situation, provide the actions that I took, and then the impacts. And if I kind of follow that structure, for me, it's a little bit easier to kind of go through it. I use my private sector resume as my starting point. Like, if this is something that I've said is a key accomplishment, then I'm going to describe what it was that I did in this one. And I'm going to do that for each bullet. And then I'm going to go to the occupational questionnaire and say, hey, what am I missing here? What do I need to make sure that I'm including also? Make that a bullet and then build it out the same way. It could be that your position, if you're able to use just the one position to qualify, that one position could be built out to a page long, and then everything else is minimized down to like a half a page. It depends on the GS level as well, because they're not necessarily looking for the same robust content for somebody who's coming in at a GS5 or a GS7, because you just don't have the same level of responsibility that maybe a 13 or 14 would.
Right. And how far back do we go on resumes, on federal resumes?
Still
Like, do I
typically about 10
encompass
years.
10 years? Okay. I was trying to figure out a while back, like, do I do everything from my whole military career? Do I include what I was doing as like a PFC, or do I just start off as like, I guess 10 years ago, I was a staff sergeant, and, and I had a supervisory position. So I figured that'd be a good area to start, especially since I was applying for like GS13s and up supervisory positions, right? Which, I mean, that was 10 years ago, so it would have been perfect. So you suggest 10 years.
Typically.
Go ahead. Okay.
Yeah, some people will have like, I've been doing, maybe they had moved into supervisory work, but they really want to get back into doing, the work that they were doing before they were a supervisor. And it's like, well, that's outside of 10 years. Like, that's okay. We can move it to the top, rename it relevant experience, highlight that, and then just kind of minimize the stuff that's been within the last 10 years. Or, maybe it's worth, some people do really want to keep, a history of their military experience, and we can just kind of do like a quick, section where it is an overview of everything outside of the last 10 years, but then we're still going to really focus on 10 years. Federal tends to fall behind private sector as they kind of move forward. Private sector best practice is still about 10 years. And when they did this whole redesign of how they do federal resumes and federal application process about 10-ish years now, 10, 15 years ago, they went from you have to include everything, people's federal resumes are 30 pages long, to let's keep it to 10 years. You're actually going to start seeing a lot more language here in the last few years where it says, we'll limit it to 5 pages. It's okay if it's longer, but we're not going to read past 5 pages. There have even been a few like higher GS levels where has said, if your resume is longer than 5 pages, we're kicking it out. So you want it to be detailed, but we want to keep it to under 5 pages.
Yeah, because who wants to read more than 5 pages, right? It's just too much.
If there's
Especially
not
if you have
ATS
how
to do
many
it for me.
applicants.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like I was on a hiring panel a while back, while I was still in uniform, and it wasn't anything crazy because I've heard the horror stories of, people getting multiple like 10s, 20s, 30s resumes. And I think we had like 5, and it wasn't anything bad. I mean, they were all pretty well qualified, but when it came down to the actual interview, and it was like not a Zoom call, it was like one of those Google Meets or something interviews. I think I told John this story. It was a guy showed up. One showed up in like a suit, right, which is fine, and one showed up with like a T-shirt that looked like it was kind of like pulled here. I asked him if he needed a couple minutes to kind of get himself together. He's like, "No, I'm ready to go." I'm like, "Well, okay." So it was a little crazy, but I mean, I guess be prepared for the interviews when it comes to that. Once you get past that whole hiring panel and all that, be prepared for the interviews too.
And also make sure that you're checking your phone and email. A lot of the time they do reach out through email. They will only reach out once. They're not required to reach out more than once. So if you don't follow up, you're SOL.
Yeah, maybe don't make sure it doesn't go to your spam or something, right? Your junk email box. No, that's good to know. I did not know that.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point to bring up, and maybe I can pull this other slide that you got up there to just kind of recap on a bunch of the stuff that we've talked about. But it's kind of like if you've been in the military before, and the majority of our audience has, in the military, it's hurry up and wait. In the federal job market, at least in my own personal experience, and I've seen many others. I was doing a Reddit scan today, looking at some questions and some answers, and one of the guys said something like, "Yeah, I finally got hired," and he's listed the timeline. The timeline was almost a year from the start, from when he put his resume in to the time where he actually is getting hired and getting started with the job. And somebody asked, like, "Well, how many jobs did you apply for?" He's like, 384. And the guy was like, 384 federal jobs? He's like, "Yeah, just federal jobs. If you count the other civilian jobs that I applied for outside of USAJOBS, and it's probably a lot higher than that." So, it's a numbers game. It's a funnel, basically. But I guess my point is you're going to have to wait a while. Like, it's not a fast process. There's no speed involved in it, at least anywhere that I've seen. And on the back end of that, they're going to want you to respond immediately. Like, so if they send you the email and they're saying, "Hey, we're giving you a job offer," even though you've waited 6 months for them to send you that email, like, they're expecting you to respond within 24 hours on that email, and a lot of other things that they require for you to get on board and things like that. So just something to think about.
Yeah. And I would also say just also remember, well, it's hard to remember from their point of view, but, different things that happen that might slow down the process. Retirees are probably a little bit more inclined to apply to positions that are going to require more extensive background checks, potentially security clearance processes. That's going to slow things down. So they're probably looking at longer application times just based on the nature of the positions that they're applying to. A lot of the time, HR specialists who are posting positions are overseeing 5 or 6 different application processes at one time. So needing to read through all 150 or so applications for each one of those takes time. And then you're also looking at different things like, it's always kind of unclear how this process works, just because it's kind of different each time. But we still don't have an actual budget this year for the federal government. They've just been continuing to pass, stopgap measures. So that does affect how agencies can hire. So if an application was started towards the end of last year, when they thought, things were going to be resolved, they thought they could move forward with this process, but it's now, April, and we don't have that formalized budget. They might be waiting on some of those positions because, something might change in the proposed budget. Even if they're being told you can move forward with this, they might not want to until they know. Or it might be, we can't move forward until we know. Even though we need this position, the team needs this position, everybody's waiting on this position to be filled, we might not be able to move forward until we know what that budget is. So there's a lot of factors that can make those processes go longer. And it can be that the moment that they get clearance, it says, yes, you can move forward with this. So, and you might have seen it after some of the stopgap bills that have gone through. If anybody, in that next week was like, let's move forward with this now. We've gotten approval to get somebody in here. Let's get somebody in here before they change their mind. Things like that. Because once you're in a position, you have certain protections, but up until you get in that position and through your probationary period, they have more flexibility to say no as well. So there's a lot of things that are happening that can influence how long that process can take. And it's a lot of the time not even something that they can control, and frustrates them as well.
Yeah, I did notice that now that you mentioned there's no budget, I just noticed that I did get an email. It was probably Friday from some position I applied for 6 months ago. I completely forgot about the position, right? But they said it's canceled now. And I believe they cited something about budgets or something. But I mean, that happens all the time, doesn't it? They cancel out the jobs, things that I was looking forward to. I was like, oh man, I fit this perfectly. Then I get an email saying that it was canceled, and or they rename it to something else. So I have to search it again. But now that you bring that up, it makes sense.
Yeah, there can be a couple different things. So, and that could be one of those scenarios where, maybe they did have somebody selected for that position and they didn't get through the hiring process the way they wanted to. And so the only way to have them try again is to cancel the job and repost it. It could be based on budgets and what is, cleared to go forward, what's not cleared to go forward. Different agencies, I know NASA's done some restructuring. It could be that they've hit the point where these programs need to merge, and maybe that, it's gone so long now that we have to just cancel that position. There's just so many things happening that, as an applicant, it's hard to know about. I just get all the inside scoop from different people that I talk to. So that's why I'm here to bring everybody information. Go through USAJOBS and just talk to a lot of hiring managers. We have a few volunteers that like to give us the inside scoop. That's how I figured out about if you look for those positions that have location negotiable. But you just wouldn't know that unless you talk to a lot of people. So definitely leverage networking is where that whole thought process was going.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole reason why we've got you on here, and the whole reason why I got to connect with you. I don't know if you can hear the doggy barking in the background, but that's the little puppy. Sorry about that for the internet. But yeah, what I do want to do is be respectful of your time. I know you got some big things going on, and probably a lot of personal planning things going on that you need to take care of for the rest of this day today. So I don't want to hold you hostage here longer than necessary, but I do want to pull up this last slide and go through this. And then also If there's anything, we'll roll out the red carpet for you at the end here. If you want to put anything out there, let anybody know about any websites that we need to throw down in the show notes or anything like that. If they want to, if you want people to contact you, where and when and how. But yeah, let's just go over this real quick. These are the 3 things that we talked about earlier on. And here's like some sub bullets under those as well.
Yeah, with eligibility, again, like I'm always make sure that you're one of the people who are listed. But with that, there's usually like a clarification just under the who may apply section. Make sure you look at that, because if it has veterans listed as who may apply, it might not be all veterans. It might be only VEOA eligible, Veterans Employment Opportunity Act eligible. Have to remember what all the acronyms mean. Sometimes you get so used to talking in them. But it might only be open to those eligibles, or it might only be open to 30% or more disabled veterans, different things like that. So, just because you are a veteran doesn't necessarily mean that you fall under every veteran who may apply category.
Do you mind if I interrupt you real quick on that?
Yeah.
For the eligibility as well, it may very well say like veterans and list a few different kinds of people who are eligible, and then they may at the very, very bottom there put in a blurb that says, yeah, despite the fact that all these people are eligible, we're only really focusing on military spouses of active duty service members, et cetera, et cetera. So be sure to look for that as well.
Mm-hmm. And then at the beginning of the qualification section, they usually do have at least a little bit more specification in that too. So definitely look through both of those areas for that. Experience. When it comes to experience, the federal government does highly prefer, I'm going to say prefer, experience over education. Now, there are certain positions where education is required, and you can't get around it. It's usually listed as a basic qualification. But even with that, there's sometimes a way to get around that depending on the position. You can have either the education requirement, or you can demonstrate 4 years of experience that allowed you to gain that knowledge that you would have received in an education. So a lot of the times there's not necessarily you are automatically out of the running for this position. Just know that they do kind of give preference to people who do have education in those situations. There could be different certifications. If you're looking at the 2210 series, certain certifications might be required. And a lot of the time they have language that says like you must have this by usually the closing date of the announcement. Sometimes you'll see it more on recent graduate positions where it's, the position's slated to start maybe at the end of the summer. So as long as by the starting date of the position you have received like your degree or, anything additional therein, and that would be fine.
And sometimes they say also, I believe in a lot of the 2210 positions, if you require like say Security Plus or something like that, they say you have up to 6 months after onboarding to finish the certification or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
The only one that I've seen so far, and maybe you've seen other ones that really adheres to that college degree thing, is the procurement specialist, like within that realm of job occupation. I forget what the job occupation number is for it, but that one for sure, at least what I've seen, is they adhere to that really, really strictly.
Procurement and contract specialists are very, very particular in the education and the experience. We come across that a lot with people who did some contracting as part of maybe being a logistics specialist. But if you don't have like the full cycle of contract management, essentially for those positions, you just don't quite meet all of the requirements. They're one of the few that are just that particular. Social worker positions, particularly the VA, they're another one where it's not even a particular type of degree, it's a particular level of degree as well.
Right.
So if you don't have a master's in social work, doesn't matter if you have a PhD in social work. If you don't have a master's in social work, it's not, it doesn't fulfill that requirement. But there are a few, but typically speaking, if you're looking at, an education to an experience level, your education will minimally qualify you, whereas we're trying to be best qualified. So your experience is usually going to kind of take you above what your education would as well, if you're kind of stacking up two people side by side.
Yeah.
And that's the thing I do like to highlight, just because I know that a lot of people in the military have kind of a love-hate relationship with education sometimes. And, especially in a lot of private sector industries, there's, I feel like arrogance is a little bit too strong, but I'm going with it for right now. That says, if you don't have this degree, we're not going to consider you in a lot of capacity. And the federal government does not have that same thing. If it's deemed important for the position, they will have certain things like that. But there's a lot of flexibility when it comes to having that higher education versus the experience that you bring to the table as a veteran. So I wouldn't let that hold you back, but just be aware of some of those, industries or job series that would be more particular about that. And yeah, the occupational questionnaire, that's your cheat sheet for the job. Always see if you can find it. It's okay to apply to a position just to get that questionnaire and use that to build your resume. It's not all of them are very good, but if you find one that is good, definitely use that to kind of build it out, at least for a series master if you want to build one of those out. That way it makes it a lot easier to tailor your resume to individual positions.
That's excellent. I will leave that up there. But yeah, if you want to, go ahead.
I was going to say, we developed a whole new webinar last year, just talking about federal myths, because there's just so many out there. And I feel like that's half the frustration. The resume is long and a little bit arduous, but half of it is just not knowing what is or is not happening. I think we've talked through a lot of these though, but definitely that myth page, I made sure it was the correct link after they did the redesign.
We'll just have to post all those, this exact thing on all these Facebook groups, because there's a lot of these things going around. There's a lot of misinformation out there that I've seen, and people just need to know straight up what it is, because these myths it's getting a little out of hand in some of these groups.
Well, I do want to say that the thing that I have found is that when you're Googling for federal specific resumes or federal specific applications, if you don't use the absolute correct combination, you get a weird, you get a lot of information that is maybe technically correct, but not specifically correct, or is also just private sector, but they've kind of rewritten it. Or, when information is just so vague, it is technically correct, but it's not really helpful. And if you don't know where private sector versus federal sector nuances are, you're going to think, hey, I can just move forward with this private sector resume as it is. And while it's a good starting point, you probably do need to add hours per week to it. You might need to build out your content a little bit more robustly, but you don't know that because you've just Googled, federal resumes, and you're going to get a monster job site where it's just the 6 top things. And that's the thing I feel like is probably perpetuating a lot of these myths. Is not that they're trying to do it intentionally, but it's just the ability to Google the right answer. It doesn't really exist right now.
And you don't know unless you, I guess, get into a webinar or are part of that community, right, where they talk about federal things or federal keywords or things like that. People who are just starting out never know.
Yeah, you are your own best advocate. Definitely go down the USAJOBS rabbit hole. Learn what you can. Participate in any of those webinars that come up on USAJOBS, especially if they're hosted by OPM. You get little tidbits of information. that's very, very helpful, very useful, especially if you listen to different people talk about it. This is a big thing I talk about with my team as we kind of talk about our own way of our own language of talking about federal. Everybody describes it just a little bit differently. Everybody's process is just a little bit differently. And sometimes somebody's way of explaining it is going to connect with you better than somebody else's way of explaining it. So look for more information, look for other people to kind of go through that, especially if it's coming from a government source. You know, it all does ultimately go back to OPM. If you're not getting it from a government source, really make sure you know who you're getting that information from, because there's just a lot of people who are federal resume writers that might not know all of the ins and outs, because sometimes you just don't have to be successful. And that's where some of that confusion comes from too. You don't have to know all of what I know to be successful in the federal process, but it does help.
It does. So, Kristen, I'd like to ask, is there anything that we haven't asked you or we haven't covered today that maybe you want to share regarding the federal process or federal hiring, resumes, et cetera?
I would say the biggest thing would just be a federal resume is still a resume. You want it to be easy to read. I always come back to this idea. You want to be proud of it. This is your experience. You're the one who's, advocating for yourself. Yeah, it's frustrating going through that. Most of us are not great writers, or we're writing about something that it's hard to write about yourself, and it's hard to go through and say, well, that's just an everyday thing, or everybody did that, but it's still all part of the picture of what your experience brings to the table, what you have learned from these different scenarios, and give yourself credit. Don't undermine what you've done. I know, especially as military people, everybody works together in groups, in teams, and you share that responsibility, you share that credit. You are a very integral part of that team. Highlight that. Highlight what you bring to the table. Don't forget that it's a resume. This is your resume. You did cool things. I know when you get people on the phone, they really get into it, and they really tell you where they're excited, and then they tell you that, well, I'm just going to go do anything I can get a job. But if we really focus, and we're building this out, and we're doing this with intention, that excitement comes through. It does. So just remember, your resume is for you, and it's your tool. It's that first step, getting referred, but there's a lot of ways into the federal process, but if you have a good understanding of your background, your experience, it's going to come through in all different aspects of that job search, from networking to interviewing, to getting started in that role. So, definitely take time to figure out what it is that you want, because that everything else is going to kind of fall into place. Don't just, especially in federal, don't throw spaghetti at the wall. People can tell. It's just like, you're not into this. You haven't put forth the time. We can just tell that you're just shooting out resumes. If you take the time to put together a good resume, you're going to have more success than you're going to have 384 applications that only 12 of them did something with.
Yeah, that's right. Well, that's awesome. I think that's a good place to put a bow in it, put a pin in it. I don't even know how you say it anymore. Put a pin in it, put a bow in it.
Cherry on top.
Put a fork in it.
There you go. Yeah, it's been great. Listen to what you got, Kristen. I really appreciate you coming on. I learned a lot. I know a lot of the folks out there have probably gained a lot of good information. As soon as we post this thing up, we'll share all the information you gave out. I wrote near a 2-page document on everything you shared with us today. So I really appreciate that myself. I think it's a good place to put a bow in it, or a cherry on top, or whatever you all mentioned. I'd ask Kristen, where can people find you if they want to get a hold of you, or any kind of links that you want to share?
Well, if you are looking to get in touch with us, I am on LinkedIn. I'm not the most active person on LinkedIn. I will be the first to admit that, but me and my team are always posting information up on LinkedIn, either on myths or hiring opportunities, anything that the National Park Service does, I usually reshare. No, but you can always catch up with me on LinkedIn. It's just essentially, LinkedIn at my name. And then if you're interested in any of our services, HireHeroesUSA, definitely get signed up. Our program is an auxiliary program, so we kind of are building on top of the work that you do with your transition specialist. So you would have to go through kind of that process first. But we're kind of there to pick up and kind of grow from where you started a resume with your transition specialist. Now let's build it to be, a federal resume. What does that look like? How do we do that? A lot of back and forth to get everybody to write more about themselves. But yeah, definitely get registered, and you can be referred over to me or my team, and we can move forward that way.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm a testament to it, and I'll keep saying it over and over. And plus the fact that Amanda, my caseworker, as I call her, she's always like, "Hey, do you need anything?" And I'm like, "Yeah, we're trying to do this thing on the podcast." And she's like, "I'm gonna put you in touch with somebody who knows something, so I'm gonna get you and get them on the
Amanda's
show for you."
amazing. I have no short of awesome words to say about her.
She is the best. She's my guardian angel on the mental health of transitioning side of things for sure. So kudos, flowers to Amanda for putting this all together and making the connection. And again, it's just networking, right? It's put your thoughts out there in the world and keep putting them out there, and eventually somebody's going to be like, "Oh yeah, I know the person who knows this thing," and make the connections happen, and then magical moments like this happen. So but yeah, anytime you want to come back on, I think it's important. I think what you mentioned about, USAJOBS just updated the website, things in OPM change, things in the government change, the budget changes, all these changes happen. And you sound like you've got your ear to the train tracks, listening for the next locomotive to come along. So yeah, if there's any updates or anything you want to circle back on, in a couple months from now or whenever, feel free to just reach out and let us know, and we'll get you back on and do this again.
I can talk about federal all day. I mean, I do talk about federal all day, every day. Yeah, there's actually another website. It's more geared towards current federal employees, but they do have applicant stuff. It's called FedWeek. Has a lot of, if you're just kind of looking to stay up to date on federal trends and different policies that are kind of going out. I just set up a lot of Google alerts based on things that I know I want to get more information on, and that's when that comes through a lot. But yeah, they have a lot of good information. A lot of it's more geared towards current federal employees, but they'll have different things that come through for applicants, or different articles that kind of go out about things to keep in mind.
Nice. Yeah, that looks like a good one. I think I could probably read that one for hours and hours and hours.
And they're constantly, it's a news website, so they're constantly putting out new articles and staying on top of different changes. The Schedule F stuff was a big thing I think they were reporting on this past week, just because of a few changes that I think OPM passed to kind of try to limit some of that. So,
yep.
Oh yeah,
definitely. No, that's good to know. I mean, of course, stay in the know on the organizations that you want to join up with, like, DOD, DOL, different ones, Homeland Security. It's always good to be educated on whatever you're looking to get into. Kristen, I really appreciate all this information and your time today.
Yeah, I had a great time. So if you guys have any additional questions you want to shoot my way in the future, let me know. Be happy to come back and talk through anything else.
Excellent.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, hopefully we'll get some more questions. And if you're out there listening and you're watching, or you just caught this after the live stream and you don't want to do all this crazy homework and read, FedWeek every day for the next 30 days, you just come here and we'll give you all the information. So we'll give you the cliff notes.
I just thought of another one too. Sorry, I'm like that.
Hit me up.
There's another website called Government Exec. They have a podcast. I've only listened to a few, and by a few I mean I've listened to one of their podcasts because it
That's
was
enough for us.
I my master's degree is in public administration, and one of the books that we had to read was written by somebody who was on this podcast. I was listening to that, but they had done a whole evaluation on veterans preference and how it worked, and if they thought it was working the way it should work, and proposed changes to it and different things like that. So that's what they were kind of talking about, were some of their findings from that study. But it's another good website to give you up-to-date information on different things.
Nice.
Good.
So
Definitely check that out.
shout out to govexec.com. If you're out there listening, you should reach out to us or let us know how to reach out to you so we can make some things happen and do some collaborations. And I'll let Victor handle the rest of that because he's like a pit bull on these things.
Yeah, a master networker. Awesome.
Cool. Sweet.
Yep. Awesome. Good, great information. I'm definitely going to be going on these sites and checking some of these things out, getting more educated. And let me see here. If you all, for anybody out there listening, if you have not joined yet the military retirement group on Facebook, we're going to be putting all this information on there. It's being live streamed right now on the military retirement group on Facebook, as well as LinkedIn, YouTube. So you can find us everywhere and listen to Kristen shoot out some good information on all federal hiring and resume info. So Kristen, again, I appreciate your time. John, always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. And if you want to check us out after the fact and you missed the live stream, you can always check us out on YouTube. You can check us out on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and all those places. And you can check us out on Reads Across America Radio. I have to edit the subtitles because it always says Reads without the W. But yeah, you can find us there on Wednesday evenings. We're there as well. So come check us out. We've got links up here in the top here you can check out as well. So thank you very much, everybody. And thank you both for being here with us and making this very, very, very insightful.